Kandyce Young, Senior Technical Product Manager of all things data in environment. And I'm really excited to have this particular discussion because we get a lot of questions about vulnerability management on a regular basis. And so this presentation was built upon all of the different questions we've received, and we kind of put it together into a nice cohesive presentation for you. So I hope you'll find some nuggets of answers that you've been just so eagerly awaiting. Vulnerability management is something that is very near and dear to my heart. And once I get started with this, you're going to be very excited that you stayed put. So today's session is certainly all about clarifying vulnerability management in PCI DSS. Vulnerabilities are security weaknesses, and that's a common way for attackers to gain access to systems. New security holes and bugs are discovered daily, and attackers can exploit them and take advantage of them. In 2023 alone, 25% of high-risk vulnerabilities were exploited on the same day, and then 50% of those were exploited within 19 days. Vulnerability scans help you identify and address these weaknesses before the attackers can exploit them. PCI DSS includes requirements for external ASV scans, which are scans of internet-facing IPs that are performed once every 3 months, and they're a pass or a fail performed by an approved scanning vendor. PCI DSS also has requirements for internal vulnerability scans, and your organization runs those once every 3 months. And whether internal vulnerabilities are resolved or addressed, that's defined by your risk-based process. We're often asked if penetration testing is the same as vulnerability scanning, and the answer is no. Pen testing tries to exploit vulnerabilities. It may find vulnerabilities, but that is not the goal. The goal is to try to break into systems and networks. It complements, but it does not replace scanning. A bit more on external ASV scans. They are scans of external-facing IP addresses, which are your riskiest areas. They're internet accessible. They have to be done once every 3 months using a PCI-listed application or scanning vendor. The result is a pass or a fail, and it happens during that 3-month period. But you need the passing result, which means no medium or high vulnerabilities and no CVSS vulnerabilities rated between 4.0 and 10. If you don't pass the first time, you can fix those vulnerabilities and rescan within that 3-month period until you do. Assessors look for clear evidence of those 4 passing scans, which at least once every 3 months, for the year. So in 2024, we released an ASV guide to help organizations understand this a little bit better. And so that QR code there takes you directly to that 2-pager that we released. So scanning, certainly, the requirement is once every 3 months, but we recommend you scan as often as possible because there are so many benefits to being aware of your environment on a regular basis. It helps you lower your risks quicker, and you have more chances to catch and fix the issues. Fixing vulnerabilities often reduces the window by which these threat actors can exploit your vulnerabilities. So many entities scan their environments monthly or even weekly, and that increases their chances of having a passing scan within that 3-month period. So your process to identify and risk rank internal vulnerabilities is important, as it's key to understanding and addressing your organization's unique security risks. And that's what we mean by risk-based approach. The high-level steps are here. You identify vulnerabilities, risk rank them for your environment, then resolve or address them accordingly. The location and the context of these vulnerabilities matter a lot. So for example, you have a worn tire and you see a damaged tire here, but where is it located? The context is certainly important. If this old tire that you see here is on a truck that you're driving on the highway, well, most of us will agree that represents a huge risk. You have less control over your vehicle, and there's a risk that the tire may blow. But what if you have a second tire, and that tire is also worn, and there's a nail in that tire? Has the risk increased or decreased? If the damaged tire is the spare tire that you have on the back of your truck, well, is that the same risk? However, other risks may come into play now if your vehicle did end up getting a flat tire. But the presence of that second damaged tire, that isn't increasing the initial risk. What if the vehicle has a third damaged tire? It can really go on. If the truck is on the road or if it's in the garage. So the point of this analogy is, depending on where the damaged tire is, that changes the risk of the damaged tire. So the risk and the impact of a vulnerability changes. The same vulnerability can be risky for certain types of environments or certain types of systems, dependent on where they are. So you cannot treat those vulnerabilities the same for every single system. So two PCI DSS requirements focus on identifying and risk ranking vulnerabilities. Requirement 11.3.1, which is about running internal scans to identify those vulnerabilities. Then requirement 6.3.1, which is about evaluating those scan results along with vulnerability information from other sources. Then you assign risk ranking at a minimum that's identifying high risk or what's critical for your environment. You can use external rankings if you agree that they work for your organization. If not, you can assign your own risk ranking using some asset criticality, threat information, or business impact analyses. Either way, you now have your risk ranking. And let's talk about PCI DSS requirements for resolving and addressing vulnerabilities. You identified your critical or high-risk vulnerabilities according to the risk ranking that we just mentioned. For critical vulnerabilities, they must be resolved by installing patches within 1 month. And for high-risk vulnerabilities, they're resolved by installing patches within the time frame that you determine based on your identified level of risk. For all of the other risk rankings that are not high risk, you address them based on a targeted risk analysis that you prepare. The targeted risk analysis contains timeframes and a risk-based decisions for how or if to resolve or address those other vulnerabilities. So to summarize here, critical vulnerabilities that must be resolved via patch within 1 month. High-risk vulnerabilities must be resolved, the patch within the time frame that you define, for example, 60 days, let's say. All other vulnerabilities that are not critical or high, they must be addressed via your targeted risk analysis. And we'll get to targeted risk analyses, or TRAs, a little bit later. But you might be wondering now, what's the difference between resolve and address? We get this question quite a bit. And here's the difference between resolved and addressed. Resolved means you fix the vulnerability. You resolve it. The vulnerability no longer exists. You install a patch, you can change a configuration, you add a compensated control, you disable a service, you can decommission a system. To address the vulnerability means that you determine if you will resolve it or address it in another way. It gives you that opportunity for a risk-based decision for that type of vulnerability. So for your organization, this may mean to fix it or mitigate the risk in another way, or even accept it, or a low-risk item after a targeted risk analysis is performed. You need to track these decisions and review any risk-accepted items on an annual basis. And we do have an infographic available that walks you through these different changes or these different steps. It explains the flow across scanning, risk ranking, resolution, and verification. You can look for that in the PCI DSS document library, available with other PCI DSS materials. So how can we make this risk ranking even smarter? Well, when we talk about internal vulnerabilities, it's important to separate severity from risk. CVE, this is a simple identifier. It's a catalog entry that says, hey, here's a vulnerability. On its own, it doesn't really tell us much about how dangerous it is. CVSS, the scoring system, gives us a measure of severity. For example, it tells us whether something is rated critical or high. And it's theoretical. It doesn't necessarily mean it's actively being exploited within your systems. EPSS, so this model predicts the likelihood of exploitation in the real world, and it helps move us from theoretical severity to probability-based perspectives. And finally, the KEV. This is where we bring evidence, vulnerabilities that are actually being exploited and tracked globally. If it's on the KEV list, we know that attackers are actually using it in the wild. Risk, finally, when we layer the business context, where the asset is, how the asset is being exposed, whether it's internet-facing or it's deeply segmented within your network, that's when we truly understand the risk. So the severity gives us the starting point, but the risk requires the context for the technical, business, and threat-based types of decisions. This is how we make smarter, defensible prioritization decisions. A vulnerability may not be the same across all of your systems, as I mentioned earlier. They may not be a need for immediate patching, so the context is key. And two signals stand out that I mentioned on a previous slide. It's the KEV, which shows us that what attackers are exploiting right now, and the EPSS, which predicts what they are most likely to exploit next. But scanning those two signals on their own, they're not enough. To get the full picture, you'll need to combine this with other trusted vendor sources, CERT alerts, commercial feeds, dark web monitoring, SBOM data, and even bug bounty reports. When you bring all of these different sources together and feed them into a centralized risk ranking process, that can transform a static log list of vulnerabilities into a prioritized list of actionable risks. In other words, threat intelligence and multiple data sources turn theory into action. Now for targeted risk analyses. So TRA, targeted risk analyses. You need one to support your decision about how you're resolving or addressing those all other vulnerabilities that I mentioned earlier. As different types of inputs, you can consider ranking you've assigned vulnerabilities, which assets do those vulnerabilities have, and how critical those assets are to your environment. Analyze the risks according to each asset. Where is the asset, how critical it is, and for your outputs, you rank the risk based on the asset, which vulnerabilities need to be resolved, and in what priority. QSAs would need to see your targeted risk analyses and supporting documentation. And that TRA almost becomes your audit trail about why you didn't patch something immediately or how the decision is appropriate to support the risk in your environment. A new requirement was introduced in PCI DSS version 4 that, as of March 2025, all internal vulnerability scans are authenticated, except where a system can genuinely not accept credentials, which you must document. So let's look at the difference between authenticated and not authenticated scans. Unauthenticated scans, that means no username or password. You only see what the external attacker sees, external attacker without any credentials may see. With authenticated scans, that uses the system credentials where, with privileges, you can see deeper into systems, configurations, default passwords, missing patches, hidden exposures. Authenticated scans will find way more vulnerabilities, especially when you're scanning the first few times. So be prepared and allow yourself the opportunity to resolve these new vulnerabilities that you'll find. So the takeaways really here are that vulnerability management in a nutshell. For ASV scans, you scan at least once every 3 months, but certainly it'll make your life easier if you scan on a more frequent basis. These scans are a pass-fail, and all vulnerabilities with a CVSS score of 3.9 and above must be resolved. And resolve the vulnerabilities and rescan until you have a clean scan. Work with a PCI-listed ASV vendor for your external ASV scans. And you need at least one passing scan within the 3-month period. For your internal scans, consider doing the scans more often as well, and remember about using the different multiple sources for your vulnerability information, not just the scan results. Identify and risk rank your vulnerabilities. Once the risk ranking is agreed by your organization, then you can prioritize accordingly. Either resolve via patching or use risk-based decisioning to address lower risk vulnerabilities. With that approach that you document in a targeted risk analysis. So hopefully this presentation has helped you in a few ways here. The goal was to clarify vulnerability management in PCI DSS, so that requirement 6 and requirement 11 kind of correlation, explain the differences between ASV scans and internal scans, and talk about how using a risk-based approach can help you resolve or address your internal vulnerabilities. And finally, how targeted risk analyses can support risk-based decisioning. So if you've got any other questions about this presentation or any other questions about PCI DSS, come see me later on today and we can talk more about it. Thank you so much.